The Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, or CIRCA, is a multidisciplinary institute that brings together experts in the natural sciences, planning, engineering, economics, political science, finance, and law to provide practical solutions to problems arising from climate change. CIRCA's mission is to increase the resilience and sustainability of vulnerable communities to the growing impacts of climate change. The institute is located out of Yukon Avery Point and was founded in 2014. CIRCA has several focus areas including coastal and inland flooding, extreme heat, sea level rise, environmental justice, emergency management, and policy. CIRCA works to strengthen coordination with state agencies to support the advancement of Connecticut's climate goals, engages directly with municipalities through initiatives such as the Resilient Connecticut program, conducts research to inform state policy and decision-making, and collaborates with partners across Yukon. Today, CIRCA consists of 9 professional research staff. This map shows the variety of resilience projects CIRCA works on, such as flood sensors, heat sensors, and site-specific town projects conducted through the Resilient Connecticut program. One of CIRCA's primary programs is called Resilient Connecticut. The Resilient Connecticut program began in 2018 in Fairfield and New Haven counties in response to Superstorm Sandy. Since then, the program has expanded into the Lower Connecticut Council of Governments, the Southeastern Connecticut Council of Governments, and the Capital Region Council of Governments. The goals of the Resilient Connecticut program are threefold. First, to help municipalities in developing implementable resiliency projects. Second, to support the development of a statewide resiliency project pipeline. And third, to increase the coordination among municipal, regional, and state planning initiatives. As part of the program, CIRCA has developed several data and mapping tools. These include the Climate Change Vulnerability Index, or CCVI, with separate viewers for flooding and extreme heat. There are approximately 350,000 grid cells covering the state of Connecticut, and each cell contains an overall vulnerability score calculated as sensitivity times exposure over adaptive capacity. CIRCA also mapped zones of shared risk, which are regions that already face common flood-related challenges or may experience these challenges in the future because of climate change. CIRCA used GIS to digitize these zones of shared risks based on hazard mitigation plans, FEMA flood zone, or municipal input. CIRCA also collaborated with CT Deep to develop an environmental justice screening tool, which incorporates elements of social vulnerability. Finally, CIRCA developed a map of resiliency opportunity areas, or ROARs, which serve as the foundation for site-specific resilience projects. CIRCA develops ROARs through GIS by overlaying our data tools mentioned on the previous slide with additional layers such as critical facilities, transit-oriented development, historic resources, and regional assets to identify areas where multiple risks and priorities overlap. For example, in East Haddam, the roar seen here on the right of the screen, flooding from Sucker Brook is a recurring concern in the town center. The brook's overtopping has affected structures associated with the Goodspeed Opera House, a regional asset attracting 80 to 100,000 visitors annually. Flooding also impacts residential homes in the area. The area also includes the town's wastewater treatment plant and pump station, which are vulnerable to flooding from the Connecticut River. Throughout the program so far, CIRCA has identified 177 ROARs, 63 in Fairfield and New Haven counties, and 114 in Rivercog, Southeastern Cog, and Krog. CIRCA then uses our evaluation framework for resiliency projects, known as the PERSIST framework, to rank these resilience opportunity areas. We engage municipalities with higher rankings to assess their interest in moving a project forward. If a municipality chooses to proceed, CIRCA hires a consultant on behalf of the town to assess current and future environmental conditions at the site and develop adaptation options. So far, CIRCA has done 14 site-specific projects, 7 in Fairfield and New Haven counties, and 7 in Rivercog, Southeastern Cog, and Krog. We will now briefly highlight one project, East Haddam. As a reminder, flooding from Sucker Brook affects the Goodspeed Opera House facilities, including the rehearsal studio, actor housing, library, and costume studio. A number of nearby residential properties are also impacted by the flooding. The town's wastewater treatment plant and pump station lie within this area and are also vulnerable to flooding from the Connecticut River. The project team for the Resilient East Haddam project included Circa, the town, and an external consultant firm, Kleinfelder. Kleinfelder performed hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, or H&H modeling, to analyze current and future flooding conditions. The modeling effort identified key areas for implementation of flood mitigation efforts. With stronger storms anticipated by mid-century, the analysis showed that the community will experience increased damage to key assets due to flooding if no mitigation steps are taken. To ensure that the project reflected the town's need, Cirque and the consultant did extensive stakeholder engagement. Monthly meetings were held with the project team. 4 Citizen and Technical Advisory Committee (CTAC) meetings were held, and 2 public workshops were also held. Stakeholder input informed the conceptual designs and alternatives that were developed for the final report. The recommended alternatives that were developed through modeling and stakeholder engagement for East Haddam included removal and relocation of the Goodspeed rehearsal studio, which sits over Sucker Brook, restoration of the Sucker Brook channel at the rehearsal studio site, upsizing of the Creamery Road box culvert, construction of a concrete barrier along the perimeter of the East Haddam wastewater treatment plant buildings, and raising the backup generators and electrical and control equipment at the wastewater treatment plant and pump stations. As you can see from the model on this screen, making these changes will decrease the flooding in the area and reduce damages to property and the risk to public safety. In the upcoming year, Circle will also expand the Resilient Connecticut program into the final 2 corners of the state, the Northeast and Northwest. We also will continue to work in the existing projects area to identify funding opportunities and continue advancing past projects like East Haddam from design to implementation.
In addition to its work with municipalities, Circa has also partnered with community-based organizations to support community-led climate projects across Connecticut through the Climate and Equity Grant Program. The inspiration for this grant program came from the Governor's Council on Climate Change, or GC3. The GC3 is one of the main vehicles for organizing state climate efforts in Connecticut, and it includes members from state agencies, universities, nonprofits, and other groups within the state. The council has 2 primary objectives: monitoring the state's greenhouse gas emissions reductions and advancing adaptation and preparation for the impacts of climate change. In 2021, the Equity and Environmental Justice Subcommittee of the GC3 recommended supporting more community engagement in state climate planning and implementation. In response, the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection partnered with Circa to develop the Climate and Equity Grant Program, which aimed to increase the capacity of vulnerable communities to mitigate, plan for, and respond to climate change impacts. This program had an explicit focus on equity because not all communities are equally impacted by the climate crisis, and those who are most vulnerable to climate impacts are often those who are already disproportionately impacted by other socioeconomic or environmental challenges. Circa designed the program to take into account both distributive equity, which is focused on outcomes, and procedural equity, which is focused on process. Some of our efforts to ensure both types of equity are listed here. Projects funded so far have included tree planting, community outreach and youth engagement, air quality monitoring, composting, curriculum development, and more. Nearly all of these projects have been led by community groups within Connecticut's state-designated environmental justice communities. Community-scale projects like these are essential to effective climate adaptation, as they can reach audiences beyond those reached by state and municipal efforts, particularly in historically underserved areas, and can help to empower collective climate action. Circa's research team also conducts research to inform adaptation and resilience planning in Connecticut so that decisions can be made with the best available science. One example of how Circa's research has influenced state policy is the sea level rise planning threshold. Circa's research on water levels in the Long Island Sound, alongside a range of climate scenarios, led to a recommendation that Connecticut towns should plan for at least 20 inches of sea level rise by the year 2050. More details about this research can be found in the 2019 report, Sea Level Rise in Connecticut, on Circa's website. Circa is currently working on an updated climate report for Connecticut, although it is likely that the planning threshold recommendation will remain the same. This planning threshold was incorporated into Connecticut Public Act 1882 to guide hazard mitigation and evacuation planning in coastal towns. Modest changes in sea level have a significant impact on flood risk. This slide shows water level data from a New London tide gauge over 80 years. In that time frame, the storm surge level exceeded 4 feet only 5 times. But if sea level was 20 inches higher, the storm surge would have exceeded that level 48 times in the same time period, even if there were no changes to storm intensity or frequency. In other words, areas that flood infrequently under the first scenario would flood a lot more frequently under the second. Coastal towns in Connecticut already experience coastal flooding and are already experiencing the contributing impacts of rising sea levels. These towns will need updated and locally specific data to guide them so that they can plan accordingly. Circa's research team also works with municipalities directly on site-specific projects. An example of a living shoreline project that Circa worked on is Thatch Bed Island in Essex, which has been consistently losing land. This loss has happened most actively on its southeastern spit, as you can see in the top left photo from its satellite mark between 1991, the green line, and 2023, the red line. Circa's goal was to understand what is driving this erosion and to test whether a low-crested shore parallel barrier, a geotube, could reduce the forces that move sediment away from the island. We combined historical shoreline change analysis, field measurements of currents and sediments, and a numerical model that we calibrated to local conditions under different configurations of these geotube barriers around the island. Field equipment is shown in the photos. It's important to emphasize something here. Fieldwork alone tells you what happened during the measurement window, and modeling alone tells you what should happen under the assumptions you set. Neither of these, by itself, captures the real-world performance of a shoreline intervention. Projects like this are inherently complex because success depends on more than hydrodynamics, but also construction details, material behavior, site access, vessel interaction, ice and debris impacts, permitting constraints, and long-term operations and maintenance. That's why we deliberately added site visits and interviews with long-term practitioners to understand how these systems behave after years in the water, what fails, what lasts, what maintenance actually looks like, and what surprises show up. This project is an example of how resilience and adaptation problems need to be tackled holistically. As we look to the future, we expect Connecticut to face increasing climate impacts, with a corresponding need for increased investment in resilience and adaptation at the state and local levels, sustained over the long term. Circa's work aims to help Connecticut communities take action based on sound science for a safer, more resilient future. To learn more about Circa's work, please visit the Circa website and the Resilient Connecticut website.